Thank you, everybody. I'm unbelievably honored to be here. Can I just test the sound, check the sound is okay for the recording? All good? Okay. It's so great to be here, and it's especially great to talk to teachers and the people that take these stories and messages into the schools where they are. So powerful, I think, for students coming up to realize the importance of these ties. And I particularly mean, when I say that, children who are maybe not of African origin, to understand what it means to those who are, which I think is incredibly important. I'm standing up here, I'm sorry it's a bit formal. I'm standing up here because I'm going to flick through some things on the screen. Afterwards I'll sit down. Please, let's have a very informal conversation about this. I'm happy to answer any questions and talk with you about it. But before that, I was just going to talk to you a little bit about the project behind the film. They Are We was made for a popular audience and for schools and so on. And one of the hardest things for me to learn as an academic historian was how little of the history can actually go into the film before people turn off. And that was a really hard thing for me to learn. I would put in more history, as was always my training, and then we would have test screenings, and people, as soon as you got into the academic history stuff, people would just be, falling asleep, tuning out. So I had to take all that out. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't years of more traditional research behind the project. And what I wanted to talk to you a bit about today, first of all, is that project, and basically the woman who I think the film is basically about, Josefa Diago. I don't actually know her African name, and I dearly wish that I did. In the absence of any African name for her, I will have to call her Josefa Diago, although I am aware that's deeply problematic to call somebody only by the name they were given by their slave master and his own surname, which is what she took when she became a free woman. But I want to talk a bit about that because I think that is the heart of the story. And I want to talk about what that means in terms of identity and African American, Afro-Caribbean identities, which I think is perhaps not brought out enough in the film because of this need to make a very linear film that a linear story that people can identify with. What I want to say right here at the front is that there's many different kinds of connections between the African diaspora and Africa, and I don't in any way want to privilege this cultural connection. There's many other kinds of connections that people can have. And although this is a story about a cultural connection, I'm very far away from thinking that that's the only connection or that that's how we should always seek African American and African connections. I think they all can basically fit into a much bigger, wider discussion about African American identities and links with Africa. Okay, so the story behind They Are We, I think, is of one very tough and very determined and a very atypical lady, Josefa Diago. Her story, as far as I've been able to piece it together, looks something like this. I think it's kind of interesting for us to look at her story from the other end, from a kind of roots perspective, if you would. Like if we look at her being born in Africa and going out into the diaspora, whereas the film is very much an African American or Afro-Caribbean perspective of tracing the roots back. So I'm going to see how different it looks if we look at her as an African child being born and going out into the diaspora through the horrific circumstances of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, Josefa was born somewhere in the chiefdoms of the Bantu people, which today are in the southern part of Sierra Leone, close to the Taya River. I think I have a map. That's Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa. That's where the Bantu people are. Freetown is the capital of the north. Liberia, the free colony of African Americans, is just to the south of this, just off the map. The lands would have been bigger, more extensive when Josefa was born there. They may have been in a slightly different place. We're not sure. It's very difficult to talk about the culture of the Bantu people that she was born into because they are perceived, as the historical dictionary of Sierra Leone says, to no longer be in existence. And the Bantu language too is considered to be extinct. But of course, it's much more complex than that, as you saw in They Are We. In fact, this is a very interesting example of how the transatlantic slave trade forced ethnicities to change. The Bantu was an ethnic group that was born of their attempts to escape the slave trade. They'd actually fled from farther north. This is the Timini, which is today one of the biggest groups in Sierra Leone. And they actually got attacked in a jihad that was launched from an Islamic group in the Fouta Djallon, which is today across in Guinea. And I think you can see that that has quite a lot of resonance with what's happening in the world today in terms of Boko Haram, in terms of ISIS or ISIL, all those things. It's been going on back to these times. So in the 1720s, the group in the far southeast broke away and became separated from the rest of the Timni and became known as the Bantu people. Now, that was quite a good place to settle until the slave trade was abolished. I know that sounds counterintuitive. That's exactly what I mean. When the slave trade was illegalized by Britain and the US in 1807 and 1808, slave traders didn't stop slave trading. They just got more devious. They moved away from traditional ports, such as the ones you probably know from Lest We Forget tours and those kinds of things, like Cape Coast Castle and Elmina. They moved away from slave trading there. You were much too likely to get caught. And they moved to places like Gallinas or Gallinas. Having spent years making the film in Cuba, I always pronounce it Gallinas, but you can say either in the US, Gallinas, Gallinas, whichever one. And the reason that Gallinas became a major slave trading port, which some of you will know was the home of Pedro Blanco, who sold the Amistad slaves, the reason that that became it was so appealing for illegal slave traders was because, as one of them said, it had the exact right the exact right mixture of peace at the coast and lots of wars inland, which meant there was a steady supply of captives coming down to the coast. The other reason it was really popular was because of this, which is what happened? The sea bar. You can see this is the Atlantic Ocean on the left of the picture, and you can just see up there that there's all these little creeks and rivers just behind the sea bar. What this means is that the slave ships can pull up right to here and get over the sea bar at high tide, and they can just meander there because people started sending out much smaller slave ships after the slave trade was abolished. They're much faster, they can move much stealthilier away from the patrol ships. And at high tide, they can get over there into those little creeks you see at the back and get their slaves on, their captives on. The patrol ships are bigger. They can't get across the sea bar. They're stuck out here in the Atlantic. Gallinas or Gallinas is the perfect place to illegally slave trade. It also means that slaves like Josefa can come down these creeks at the back and get straight to the slave ship. In terms of illegal slave trading, this is wonderful. I realize it's very sad to say these things. So you can imagine that for the Bantu, this is, so you see 1807, 1808 comes. This is Gallinas, not at all important in the legal era of slave trading. As soon as it's illegalized, you see what happens. As many people were leaving from, as many captives were leaving from a single year, in a single year in Gallinas, in the illegal period, had left in a century beforehand. For people like the Bantu, who are so close, as you saw, it is devastating. It's absolutely devastating. For the whole hinterland, this was absolutely devastating. There's reports that whole areas were depopulated as people ran inland to try and escape. There's lots of reports of famine because people are abandoning their crops to try and flee away. It also has a really fundamental effect on ethnic groups because there's even, there was a very well-known inter-ethnic confederation of people that tried to join an inter-ethnic group, which is almost unheard of, in order to protect themselves and their children. This confederation was slave trading, but the idea was that if you were in the safe town of this powerful confederation, you yourself would not be slave traded and your people would not, your children would not. That was the desperation that these people had. For the Bantu, it was absolutely devastating. So having gone there to escape the slave trade, they then end up right in the line of fire of the slave trade. They also end up, as the Mendi, the other big ethnic group in Sierra Leone, moves towards the coast, their lands are utterly taken over. There are stories that, let me see, there are stories that there's a place today called Moigwe. I apologize for the pronunciation. The best I can do is Moigwe, where it's said that the Bantu warriors were finally routed and disappeared into the sea in a whirlpool. That's the mythology of what happened to them. As early as the 1830s, the Mendi, the group that came for them, that came for their lands, they were working for Pedro Blanco at the coast, the major slave trader. The Bantu, this tiny ethnic group, was never going to survive this, and they did not. There are none left today. The worst thing, possibly I would say the worst thing about slave trading in this illegal period is that it's overwhelmingly children. You can fit more children on a slave ship, you can crowd them in more easily, you can much more easily brainwash them to not say anything should the patrol ship get you. Should the patrol come and say you're illegally slave trading, you can far more easily brainwash children to not reveal that they are enslaved, that they are captives. These are exactly the same reasons that people take child soldiers today in exactly the same part of the world. So, as my colleague Benjamin Lawrence has written, the age of the age of abolition, at least in West Africa, is actually the age of child enslavement. We see it in the Americas and Britain as this great age of abolition. It's not happening in Gallinas. It's just not, unfortunately. So the Bantu are completely decimated by the transatlantic slave trade. But this is not to say that they're all dead, of course not. When they say the ethnic group of the Bantu no longer exists, what they mean is they've been subsumed into the Mendi that came for them. So young Bantu women and girls became the wives of Mendi men. And some deliberately amalgamated because it's much safer to be in a big group than a small group. That's the way to keep yourselves safe. By about 80 or 100 years after this, there was nobody left who identified themselves as Bantu rather than Mendi. But what's quite interesting, I think, is that the kind of Mendi that are down here in the south of Sierra Leone are known as the Bar Mendi, as opposed to the rest of the Mendi. And what Bar Mendi means is the different Mendi. And some people have suggested, and I think this is quite convincing, that they're different because they're part Bantu. They've assimilated all these Bantu traditions into the Mendi. And so the Bantu are a fascinating case for ethnic identity in Africa because they were separate as a Bantu people because they was fleeing from slavery. Then they were wiped out because of slavery, and yet they still are, in some ways, the Bantu are, even today, known for having things that were specific to the Bantu, even though if you ask them their ethnicity, they would say they're Bar Mendi or Mendi. Okay. What I want to say also is that the things that that they are famous for are very relevant to Josefa's life and to the film that you've seen this morning. The songs and dances that she took with her to Cuba are very much their passport, their identity, and they were up until the Civil War. This is common in many parts of West Africa. But in this group especially. The songs and dances that they have, even in the Civil War in Sierra Leone, which was 1991 to 2002, this was their primary mode of identifying themselves when they got cut off from anyone else, much more than an identity card or anything else. If you can sing the same initiation songs and dances as someone else, you are their brother or their sister. That's very clear. What was also interesting in the Civil War was that the last Meander leader who you saw in the film, Lucy Amara, she was initiating children and especially girls because she believed that the things that she taught them would protect them should they be taken away by the rebels. As you saw in the film, they actually lost around half of their children as the rebels moved in, were kidnapped. It's a thing that's so horrific it's hard for us to even get our heads around. But Lucy believed, and they all believed, that this Meander, let me break down and say, Meander and Mendi, it's very confusing. I dearly love they had a different name for their society that doesn't sound almost identical to the ethnic group that they got taken over by. One has an E on the end, one has an A on the end. So Mendi is the ethnic group, Meander is the very specific initiation group that the film is about. So Lucy believed that the Meander training, the training for this initiation society, would keep the mostly girls and the few boys that are in the society safe if they were taken by the rebels, because their herbal remedies would protect them from malaria and skin diseases and so on. And the Bantu are also famous for having great supernatural skills. Now, look, this may not be within my worldview. I don't think it matters. That's not what's important at all. It may not be within your worldview. I think it's very clear that it matters a great deal to them. And I think that's very interesting for the story of Josefa, because if other historians have found in Brazil that supernatural powers, I don't have a better term for them than that, but something that we would consider supernatural, they would consider part of everyday life, were very, very important to slaves in Brazil and most likely in Cuba too, because it's something the master cannot take away from you. He just cannot take that away from you. It's not in his worldview. It's something you can fight back with no matter what else he takes away. It's very important. And I want to say that when Lucy told me she was teaching the girls and the boys that who were going to be kidnapped, most likely in this most horrific civil war, some of them didn't come back for 8-9 years. Many of them are still not back to this day. They just don't know what happened to them. When she told me that, I was really like, wow, is that what happened to Josefa? Did they really think that if they initiated her into this, it would give her the skills for life? And of course it is. Even today, these are life skills. They consider them to be the equivalent of our, going to school and having education. Of course, this is something that she would have treasured. Okay, let me just move on. So yes, at some point in her childhood, Josefa would have gone to be initiated into the women's society. There's a boys' equivalent. Everybody is in these societies, everybody across the whole region. They're called secret societies, but the thing that's secret about them is the initiation rites, which will afterwards be your identity. They are law, they are education, they are a system of social training, they are a way to communicate with the ancestors, a way to communicate with the spirits, a way to learn the skills. You learn where you fit into their society. So just as American children or Australian children might learn to debate, ready to take part in democracy, they would learn all the skills that they needed in order to take part in their own societies. It's almost unimaginable to us how important these things are. Unless you are initiated, you're not a real person. Unless you are initiated, you can't get married and give birth. Unless you are initiated, you won't be really considered trustworthy in your own society. So it's very important, I think, that once the Cubans get back to Sierra Leone, they were shown these masks. This is the male mask from the Paro Society, which is a kind of, they have different names, but this is a generic name, is the Paro Society for the men. And as you saw in the film, what they do right away is they get the Cuban men to dance behind the sacred men's mask, which was, deeply profound and telling. This is our society, we will accept you, dance behind it. And the men right away went to dance behind it. This is the woman's mask, the Bantu mask, which they got out. And you can see Lucy in the kind of mustard yellow color, dancing to the Bantu. So Josefa would have been initiated into that. And then I think, I have kind of unpicked this story, that the Meander, this other initiation whose song she's been singing in Cuba for all these years, is a kind of higher education. So the children of the families who'd founded this Upper Bantu kingdom, they went on to this higher education which was called the Meander. And I think if we see it in that way, we begin to see why this mattered so much to Josefa, why it mattered so much to her that she sung these songs for decades and decades in Cuba, because she was just about to be initiated into the peak of her society, certainly for women, to have incredible kind of status and respect in her society. And at that very moment that she's just about to become one of the most respected people in the society, she's transformed into a captive and a human commodity. It's unimaginably tragic. And I think if we begin to see the importance of the Meander society, it gives this real interest to how, why it mattered to her so much to keep singing these songs, quite apart from all the other reasons people wanted to keep singing their songs. Now, what I also want to suggest to you is that this story, what happened to her then, is probably very, very different to what happened to the ancestors of most African Americans today. Now, in saying that, I want to be very clear that I'm not in any way suggesting her experiences were not equally horrific. She was a young girl who was imprisoned, likely whipped, chained, probably starved. Most of the captives that left from Gallinas were partly starving. By one statistic, they were not much less hungry than the people in the Warsaw Ghetto in the Second World War. She could have been raped. She could have had any of these things happen to her. I'm not in any way suggesting her situation wasn't utterly horrific, but it was not like most of the people who are ancestors of today's African Americans on the mainland. And the reason for that is, again, because she came to the Americas in the illegal slave trading period. In the legal slave trading period, ships were much bigger. They went down the coast, sometimes for months. And slave ship captains considered it to be a really great thing if they could get people from all down the coast, because then they had less language in common, they were less likely to revolt. That's no longer the case. In the illegal slave trading period, you nipped across in your little fast ship, you had smaller hold anyway. Now, children are less likely to revolt than adults anyway. And then the biggest deal now is not to, you're worried now not so much about slave ship revolt as about being captured by the patrols, the anti-slave trading patrols. So what happens to Josefa, I think, is that she is still with people from the Meander society. She's still with her fellow initiates. It sounds unbelievable, but I don't think it is. As you saw in the film, there's an oral tradition in the Bantu kingdoms that that at some point in the past, one of the Meander initiation groups is all taken away. Now, as we know, oral tradition can have, a kind of interesting relation to what is written in the historical records. In this case, of course, nothing is written in the historical records. The Bantu don't have an oral tradition, written tradition. It could be that what that guy is telling me in the film is that many of their children and young people are taken, and they've amassed this into one oral tradition. That could be the case, and I fully admit this. It could also be, however, that what he's telling me has a much closer relationship to the truth. And I don't subscribe to the view that oral tradition is any more problematic than written records. They're both just problematic in different ways. They're both telling us different things. So imagine if she really is taken with others in her Meander society. Of course, that would have been exactly the kind of thing slave raiders would have done. There's a group of really young, they were probably 10, 11, 12-year-olds. They are exactly the kind of age that you can sell for the highest prices. I'm sorry to talk about human beings in that way, but let's look at it through the slave traders' perspective for a minute to see if this could be true. That's exactly who they would have gone for. They raise the highest prices. They're pretty much undefended. They're outside of the village. Of course, that's who slave raiders would have gone for. They're also the daughters and some of the sons of all the most powerful people in the village. So if you can get them, you've destroyed them. And the guy who is telling me this, it's not in the film, he tells me that his mother, up until her death, knew who some of the families were who'd gone in this. and that his mother had always told him about a woman who lost all her daughters on that occasion and never recovered from this attack. So it could be true. I mean, it could easily be true that Josefa was taken with the rest of her Meander society, and she goes, they're not far away from Gallinas, she's just put on a canoe, she goes down, she could even be sold by Pedro Blanco or one of his, she comes out of Gallinas, so either Pedro Blanco, who sold the Amistad slaves, or other of the slave traders who were his cohort there. She's with the rest of her group. Now what happens from the other side of the Atlantic is equally different to how most enslaved people, how most captives got to North America. What happens on the other side of the Atlantic is Pedro Diago in Cuba is setting up a plantation in the 1840s, which is called Santa Elena. He doesn't go and buy slaves at market. As Franklin Knight, the historian, said, by this time period, the best way to go and get captives from Africa is to charter a ship, send it over there, load it up and bring it back. This is not the same as the most North American slave owners, who went and bought them at auction, at marketplace, from traders who dealt with a slave ship coming into Charleston or wherever. Then the slaves would, these captive people who already didn't know each other and didn't share much language, then they would be broken up again on the auction block in Charleston or wherever it was. This is different. Pedro Diago sends out a slave ship from where he is. He leaves from Matanzas. He does a deal probably with Pedro Diago or certainly one of Pedro Diago's friends. The slave ship comes out from Cuba. It slips there over the bar at Gallinas, as we saw. It loads everybody on and it sneaks away as fast as it can, and they're all owned by Diago. He takes the whole cargo. If he sells them to anyone else, it's his brother whose plantation is next door. The slaves are all one unit. She is very likely, it's not impossible, it sounds crazy in a North American context, she's very likely with people that she knew for the rest of her life. This is very important. Now, I'll never be able to prove that. It's impossible to prove. But as evidence for that, this is the will of Pedro Diago from a couple of generations later. A couple of decades later. You saw part of it is annotated in the film. This marks on who they were. Now, it's pages and pages long. It's kind of horrific in itself. It says their value at the end, their age, the nation, etc. About 15% of them are listed as ganga, which is what she was listed as. She's on the top there, Josefa Ganga, 37. She was worth $750. At the time of his death, she's already been in Cuba for a couple of decades by this point. Now, there's a lot of other people on there who are the same age as her and who are ganga. It's quite possible that 2 decades earlier, given that their life expectancy has been calculated at only 7 years, it's very possible that decades earlier when she arrived, there's more of them. It's not at all impossible that she's still with other people she grew up with. Now, the reason I want to mention this is because I believe that all kinds of African American cultures they reflect, as does everybody else's culture, what was needed, what was useful to them. It's clearly the case that if you are enslaved to somebody, on a Maryland farm who owns 3 or 4 other people, you have no choice but to form a culture with them. That's what you have to do. If, however, you are Josefa Diago on a plantation at the time of Diago's death, she was one of about 400 other slaves, and he was most likely underplaying that so that his brother got more in his will. So it was probably much more than 400. More, and certainly with his brother's plantation next door, we're talking in the thousands. 70% of them are African born. They have 2 white people with them. Of course they have more opportunity to keep their own cultures alive. And what I find this absolutely fascinating, is that there's so many of them and so many African traditions that when I first met Cuco Casanova, Umberto Cuco, as everyone calls him, who you saw in the film, the old guy, this is the list he wrote for me about the Santa Elena spirits. And what some of you will recognize from this, I think, is that it isn't just, for example, that Yebe, their main god, is syncretized with San Lazaro. So let me just run you through that. Most in Cuba, as in Brazil and in other places, the spirits, the African gods, have become syncretized with Catholic gods. So that was a way. So, for example, on San Lazaro Day, which is a Catholic holiday, they celebrate Yembe. It was a way to get around your owner. If he said you could have some hours off for San Lazaro, you celebrate Yembe and claim it was for San Lazaro. And eventually they become syncretized. That's a huge simplification, but they become syncretized. What's fascinating about this, at least to me, is that they're not just syncretized with Catholic saints, they're syncretized with Yoruba saints. So the Yoruba, today from Nigeria, who are a much bigger group on the plantation, the Meander, the Ganga, the small group, have syncretized with the bigger African group, as well as the Catholic saints. So this is clearly a way that they are surviving within an African-based society in Cuba, which is just not something that happened in the Americas, apart from maybe on the Sea Islands in Georgia and South Carolina. And again, we begin to see why and how Josefa kept her traditions alive. And I want to suggest to you something that I've just started to realize, that if we go back to the idea that she had supernatural powers, that she had herbal powers, that she was indeed a female leader on Santa Elena plantation in Cuba, I want to suggest to you that as the decades went on, she was even more powerful, because from that point of view, from her point of view, she won. I mean, she won. She outlived Pedro Diago by decades. She even outlived slavery. She lived to become a free woman. In this world in which there was a 7-year life expectancy, she survived, we'll never know because we don't know exactly how old she was, 70, 80 years after she was taken there. She won. I mean, by any outlook of theirs, whatever powers she had that they believed she had, they were pretty powerful. She was winning. And I think that's kind of helps to explain why people carried on. In fact, Josefa doesn't just live long enough to outlive slavery, which is in itself an incredible thing, incredibly rare. She lives long enough to teach her stories, her songs and her dances to her great-granddaughter. Here she is, Florinda Diago. Florinda didn't die till 1984. Again, we're seeing the difference with African American communities. There were not that many people alive in 1984 in the US who were taught their songs and dances directly from an African ancestor. There were just not that many people. In Cuba, there were not that many either, but there are some, and this is one of them. Josefa Diago lived long enough to teach it to all the people that you saw in the film. And I think what's interesting, at least to me, is that their culture, it's very clear to see why they kept it alive. Florinda was known as a powerful herbal healer, even though they'd long lost any idea of what their songs and dances were in terms of herbal remedies. And yet, she was known as a herbal healer within Cuba. Once, after about the mid-60s, when Cuban medical care becomes free to everybody, that dies out and it becomes much more of a sense of identity. What's interesting, though, is that back in Sierra Leone, too, it's moved on. I think one of the dangers of all these tracing cultural roots in this way is that we assume that the Africans have stayed static. Of course they haven't. In this particular case, there's more of the Meander identity, more of the Bantu Meander identity in Cuba than there is in Sierra Leone. Today they're looking at restarting the Meander society, partly as a way to protect their children who are now at great risk of being trafficked because of the downturn in the economy since the Ebola epidemic, because of the Cuban connection. So they're hoping to get the songs and dances that they have in Cuba that have been forgotten in Sierra Leone. They know the meanings of them, and together they can start something new. Restart it, I should say, which I think is intriguing. So what I want to say is that in neither of the places do I believe that this is like a cultural retention. It's a living, breathing thing in both places. And the fact that they've both moved on and can still talk to each other is kind of an amazing thing. But it's not a cultural retention. It's a living, breathing, very transformative culture. And I think that's important to say, otherwise we kind of fall into the trap of believing that that they didn't innovate and didn't, use it for, really very practical purposes. This is not purely just something they carried with them. This is something they carried with them and use and reuse and teach and use for good. Okay, that's, I'm kind of almost at the end of what I want to say, I guess. But I just want to bring it back to that question of different identities and the different ways you can see these things. Pretty much every time I show this film in the US, although interestingly enough, almost never, I don't think ever anywhere else, and I've shown it in many places. I don't think anyone has ever not asked me about DNA testing when I show this, and whether it's possible, and whether I have DNA tested these people to make the links. This is very difficult. It's actually not possible to show that. As far as I'm aware, and I've talked to a lot of people, you have to show either fathers, 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 or mothers, 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 mothers. You can't have a connection like this where it moves down the generations, going, into different things. What's also kind of interesting is that Henry Louis Gates, I may or maybe shouldn't say, but anyway, Henry Louis Gates actually asked me if it would be possible for me to collect Bantu DNA when I was in Sierra Leone, because they just don't have enough African DNA to make the kind of connections they want to. And if there's definitely countless numbers of people, I couldn't even guesstimate, across the Americas that have Bantu DNA, that's a given. But if they were tested, if they were DNA tested, they would almost certainly show up as either Timni, the group they broke away from, or Mendi, the group they were assimilated into, because those are much bigger groups that are in these databases. And I'm not even sure it's possible at this moment, although I'm sure it will be soon, to differentiate that, what is the Bantu that are away from those. And so what I want to suggest to you is that there's different kinds of identities that are all equally valid. They can all tell us different things. Josefa, I think definitely called herself a Bantu woman for a reason I'll show you in a moment. Her descendants today, or her family today in Sierra Leone, call themselves Mendi. People in the diaspora who test and were her relatives in the diaspora could test as either Timni or Mendi. There's different kinds of identities. I don't think we're in the business or should be in the business of privileging one above the other. They tell us different things. They can complement each other. I personally feel this has been a horrific enough story that we shouldn't get into trying to privilege one kind of connection over another, because they tell us different things. Now, I'm going to end by saying, and I also want to say that the other thing that DNA testing will be kind of fascinating in a kind of fascinating way. When I talked to the Gallinas in Cuba about doing DNA testing, they were happy to do it. But their question is that they have always considered this a cultural group. And so they've assimilated people into it who actually had no idea who their African ancestors were or where they came from. And as long as they felt they were part of the Gallinas, were prepared to learn the songs and dances and follow their way of life, they were happy to have them. And I think that's a kind of beautifully inclusive thing. So for them, the issue is, am I in some way, if I did DNA testing, going to be differentiating between the kind of genetic members and the adopted members, as it were? And that's something I'm just leaving in their hands. I can't, I put it to them. They said they were happy to do it, but they didn't want to differentiate. So that's another issue. And what's also kind of interesting is that Alfredo Duquesne, who you saw in the film, the woodcarver from Cuba, if you did DNA test him, he would be at least as much Congolese, at least as far as he knows, as he is Bantu, because Florinda Diago married a Congolese man, or at least someone who thought he was Congolese. So there's all these identities together. Alfredo is very proud now to be accepted into Bantuland, but the only way he would ever be able to trace his Congolese roots would be if he DNA tested. So there's many different ways to see this, and I'm not really suggesting we privilege one over the other. Now I want to just end with one other little tidbit, and I'll show you a teeny bit of film, I think. I hope I haven't talked for too long. Now, one thing I want to say is that at the end of making Diago, in the course of making Diago, I discovered that the Ganga Longabat in Cuba were also audio recorded in the 1950s by the famous Cuban-American anthropologist Lydia Cabrera. Those songs left with Cabrera when she fled in the Cuban Revolution and are now in the Smithsonian. The people in Cuba had long ago forgotten about these recordings. Even Piuya, the old lady in the film who was singing on those recordings. Piuya is sadly no longer with us. Piuya was singing on those recordings in the 1950s, but she'd forgotten all about them. They hadn't heard about them since 1959. Of course, they'd forgotten. I managed to get permission to take those recordings back to Cuba and play them to them. And it's kind of fascinating because they're the same songs and dances, clearly. Oh, you can't see the dances, but they're the same songs, clearly. But they're sung in a very different way. I'm not a musicologist, but for want of a better way to describe it, they're much more, as we might say, African. The way they sing them today is much slower, more melodic, much more kind of like Latin music. That's obvious. But then, at the end of making Diago, I had to go back to Upper Bantu to check that they were all okay with it, that it was how they wanted it to be, to make sure all the credits wrote correctly, the subtitles, etc., were as they should be. It was only at that point that I got a chance to take the Lydia Cabrera records with me and play them. Now, this is hours and hours of footage, which of course I'm not going to show you, and I've never really edited it, so forgive me for this. But there was a song that Florinda was singing in the 1950s to Lydia Cabrera, which they tell me means, it's calling the names of the Bantu leaders, and it means something like, I am Bantu. Here's just a little bit of footage showing, it's just a minute or two. Among all these songs, there is one that means more to the people in Upper Bantu than any other.
This one is meaningful.
It sounded like you knew the song when it started.
Jolie, Bamandi. Good. For sure. These are. This one particular, those people have sung. It is so meaningful and it is direct. That's Jole Bamandi Mende Vamia Gwani or Menda Rivamia Gwani. Okay, what they are saying, they are singing directly about the Meander society. When you initiate Meander society, you have to dance. And you expect strangers to come and join you dance. So when the people come, they will say, Jole Bamande, Bamande is bad. I have heard about this this dance. That is why I have come. So I have come purposely for this dance. I have come for this Meander dance. That is exactly what those people are singing, according to our own understanding.
Okay, and I wanted to just play you that because I think what it shows is the kind of, I mean, it's not a great film clip and it's not well shot or anything, and it doesn't capture some of what they said, but you can see that Joseph, the school teacher, and actually the chief also, are really quite moved to hear that song. And I personally think it's the most amazing thing that Josefa lived long enough to pass that to her great-granddaughter, a song that tells who she was. And it says, this is who I am, these are my people. And I personally think that's amazingly powerful. And one last anecdote to finish. One of the first times I went to Upper Bantu, the Paramount Chief's wife, that was the village, the section chief you saw in the film, but the Paramount Chief, who isn't in the film, his youngest wife saw that Alfredo de Quesney is a wood carver, which is something that's very important to them. And she gave me this elephant carving for him. There he is back in Cuba with it when I took it to him in Cuba. And she wanted him to have that. And I only discovered later that the oral tradition in Sierra Leone, in the south where they are, is that the Bantu people became elephants when they died. And if you scratch an elephant underneath, you find a Bantu person. And I like to think that what she, of course that's not literal, but I like to think that what she was saying was, you might be a Cuban, you might be Afro-Cuban, you might be anything else. But if we scratch underneath, we know exactly who you are. You're a Bantu person. And he keeps that in his studio, but opposite his bed, so he can look at it, which is, I think that's beautiful. Okay, I'll end there. I'm happy to answer any questions. Let me sit down, yeah.
I came in a little bit late, so maybe I missed this in the film, but when they are listening, when the song is recorded in Cuba and played back to the Bantu people in Sierra Leone, and they're able to, are they understanding the language here? Are they able to understand the words, or is it kind of, I mean, does everyone understand the language, or?
No, because Bantu doesn't exist anymore. Right. It's only in these songs, and in a few chiefs use that language when they are initiated as Paramount Chief, and it's in these songs. But what's kind of interesting is that in both places some words are mixed into the language they speak now. So for example, in the song you hear that is, as they say in Sierra Leone, Fefe Yangi, they sing it in Cuba as Pepe Yangi, as if it's someone's name. It's not, of course. There's also in Sierra Leone, they've moved words from the Bantu language into the Mendi language, which is what they speak today. So any kind of similar words have been mixed in both countries. And yet somehow underneath all that, there's enough for them to sing these songs together, because there's enough words that are not similar enough to Spanish and Mendi to get mixed in.
So it'd be like me singing Farajaka and not knowing maybe French, but that song has been sung for so long that people can know the language. Just in the context of the song, if not the whole language.
Oh yeah, they don't speak the language at all. They had no idea what the language was in Cuba. They know what the language is in Sierra Leone, but they had no idea what language they were singing in Cuba, none whatsoever. They, interestingly enough, though, they also sing them in the same order as they do. So at San Lazaro on December 17th in Cuba, they sing them in the same order as you use them as initiation songs. So even though so much was lost, so much was retained. And there were times that I totally got it wrong. For example, there's a song that in Cuba they call Don Antonio, as if it's someone's name. It never occurred to me that was an African song. I thought it was just something that had been, sung later. Never occurs to me that this might be an African song. Only later are they singing it. I think when we went, either it's playing or they're singing it when we were all in Sierra Leone, and they can join in. It's just that it's a song in which you call the names of your leaders. And so, as I surmise, I really don't know, but at some point in the past, they had a leader in Cuba who was called Antonio. And so they sing it as Don Antonio, but the rest of the words are the same as the African songs. And they can join in, and then they start singing it, and they're saying like Papa Munda, which is what they called the oldest of the guys from Cuba. So there's lots of times that I kind of got it wrong. And I was so, being the cynical academic, and I have to get this right, I used to do things, I confess, like putting in other songs. like I would get other Afro-Cuban songs that were recorded by Lydia Cabrera, for example, because she recorded with all different Afro-Cuban groups, and I'd put them in the middle of this, you know. We'd go there and I'd say, okay, and this one, they got it right every time they would go, that's not ours. And I would go back, you know, I was so kind of like, this cannot be true. This cannot be true. How could this be true? And I would go back 2 years later and ask another old lady in a different village, and she'd say, oh yeah, it means breeze carry me to the sea. And at the end of the day, you have to be like, well, these people are not having a joint conspiracy to fool me or to fool us all. I mean, there has to be some point at which you go, yeah, well, I don't know if it's right or not, but it's what they believe. They're not just trying to fool us all. That's just ridiculous. And yeah, for 2 years, I would go back and forwards and play different songs and play them in different orders, and they could get it every time. They would be like, yeah, no, this is our song, but it should be before the other one. And you'd be like, damn, that is what they do. Excuse my language. That is what they do. And so eventually you kind of have to be like, well, I don't know, but clearly they all think that's true, and that is the story. Whether it is or not is not. Whether individual words are the same or different is not, in the end, what I think it's about, because I just don't think it can be after 200 odd years or whatever it is now.
They're all tied to rights, and the rights, just like if you're reading the Torah or whatever, they're going to be reinforced because they're going to be done the same way over generations, I guess. So that's
right.
Yeah,
absolutely. And they are rituals, absolutely. And they are very clear that Florinda Diago, their grandmother today, was... I mean, Isabel, her eldest granddaughter, or I think second eldest granddaughter, told me that even when she was grown and was a mother of her own children, Florinda would come and drag her to that place if she was not there singing on a kind of weekly basis. Now they only do it once a year, but they were strong, tough women who were not allowed to not do it. This was something that they were going to perpetuate, and they have done so. But yes, it's absolutely a religion to them as much as a culture. And I didn't go into that so much in the film because that's a very difficult thing in, I mean, it was kind of comedy in a way, beautiful comedy, that when I went back to Sierra Leone to Mokpangaba and I said I was going to can I bring these people to visit you? Would that be okay? And they, of course, were like, yes, but we want them to come to stay with us. Please, can they not just come and look at us and go, we want them to stay. So I had to get my head around that, and I went to ask them and say, is this going to be okay? And all the Cubans, to their immense credit, were like, absolutely, we're up for that, we'll do it. And I asked the old guy, Cuco, you know, he's in his 70s, and I said, if it gets too much for you, you can go and stay in the guest house. Not that that's very luxurious, but, you know, you can. We'll get a car. And he said, no, I'm doing this. So that all happened. But then I was back in Sierra Leone setting it all up, and one of them said to me, so do they know about Jesus, or should we tell them about that? And I was like, imagine the beautiful irony that you've kept alive your songs and dances and your African traditions for 180 years, and then you go back to Africa to learn about Jesus. And so I had to say, well, they do know about Jesus. It's a very Catholic country, but like you, they have both things together. So we kind of got over that one. But so it was very hard for me to put that in the song because they don't actually have that as a religion in Sierra Leone today. And after decades and decades of colonialism, as I'm sure you can understand, it would be like, you know, as they said to me, we still think of the ancestors as our ancestors and very special, but we don't worship them as gods anymore because we've been told that's the wrong thing to do. So I kind of couldn't push that religious aspect of it without insulting somebody. So we went with the kind of, and even to the Cubans, it's very much, you know, certainly Alfredo would also be initiated into Santeria, and he has Catholic saints on his walls. So I kind of didn't go down that, but it is absolutely a religion to them as well, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, yeah.
My question is more technical, the technical side of it, taking, you know, how did you choose your idea or your project, taking it into filming it, and then just some of the logistics behind it. So if you have research interest, taking academic research, and then getting it to the film production, and like I'm kind of interested in that.
I had no intention of ever making this film. I had no idea it was possible. I truly did not know that. I started off, I filmed the Gangalongabat at their ceremony. I was actually working on a totally different project altogether, about a slave factory, which is just the term for a slave warehouse, a slave trading business in, well, these slave traders had two slave factories, one in Gallinas and one just south, which is today Monrovia in Liberia. And I was following where everybody from those places went out into the world. It's a very unique case where it's possible to do that. And I was looking at where they went to in Cuba, because I know they were mostly selling captives to Cuba. And so I contacted a good friend of mine who is Cuban but lives in the UK and said, any kind of evidence of people from Sierra Leone, Liberia region in Cuba today? And he said, yeah, there's this one group left. We should go contact them. So a few months later, we were both in Havana together doing work. And he said, well, we can go, but I don't drive. And I said, that's okay. I drive, you're Cuban, you've gotten in. I'll drive, you get the way in. That's all great. So we went, and the Piuya, the old lady who's passed now sadly, she said, come back for the annual festival. You can't come and not come for the annual festival. So, okay. So went to the annual festival and filmed it. And my idea at that point was very much, I really need to film this to try and interpret it later, because my Spanish is not good enough that I always understand what people are singing or telling me right at that time. And also, I was intrigued. I was absolutely intrigued, because they said to me, this is pure Ganga. It's not anything else. Now, in my head, it's like, that couldn't be the case. They have to have adopted bits of other African ethnicities. Of course, you don't say that to people. But I was nonetheless intrigued by how they perceived that they had kept their own African religion separate from all the other bigger Afro-Cuban religions. So I filmed it. And then I'd edited that hours and hours of footage to about 30 minutes, really with an idea to just using it in my own research and showing it to other historians who don't get to, hang out in Cuba and film festivals. And, that's most people. And then I was back working on the original project in Liberia, as you saw in the film. And those people in that cafe saw, I had to get my laptop out to look for a map. And the people, I was with a colleague of mine, an Australian colleague of mine, and the people in the cafe saw the thumbnail of the edited 30 minutes on my laptop and said, what's that? Can we see that? And was so interested in it that I had to go back the next day and show the whole town, as you can see in the film. And that was just, I don't talk about this very often, because I don't want the film to be about this, and that's why I didn't put it in the film. But I'm actually fleeing from a war at that point. A war has broken out in upcountry Liberia. That's why I've got my laptop out, because I've got to get over the border into Sierra Leone and sneak the car back the other way. And it's perfectly calm now. This was like 6 years ago. It's all good. But that happened. And so when you see that in the film, where they're going around on the motorbike promoting that, there's a war in the next town. And he does, the guy on the bike, John Ballard, doesn't tell me till the end of the day, oh no, I've got to go now because my wife and children are in that town. It's like, what? You stayed to do this? Are you crazy? I mean, it's just mad. So whilst that's happening in the next town, these people are so intrigued to see this film that they've rented this place, and then they all show up. And at that point, I was like, I have to film this. I had no idea that I would make a film about and find their roots, but I was fascinated by that idea that it meant so much to them, and that they wanted to see this culture, because it does go so much against this idea that a lot of African Americans have, that Africans are not interested. And I really had to film that. It was so kind of like, really? They all showed up on this day? I mean, I know there's not that much to do there. I know it's not, Paris, but still, I mean, they all showed up to ask questions. And then as I carried on showing it to people, there was just this desperate need to help me find the answer. And what people have asked me before now is like, didn't everyone try and tell you that it was their song so you would belong to them? No, nobody else at all ever did that. In the thousands upon thousands of people that I showed it to, everybody just wanted me to tell me who these people belong to. And I had to film that. I had no idea that I would find an answer, or that it would ever lead to people that could sing along. I mean, that's too crazy to imagine. But I was so intrigued by this idea of what it meant to them, that that's what I thought I was doing, that I was filming what this ceremony meant to people across the region of Sierra Leone and Liberia. And then the logistics of doing the project were nightmarish. I mean, I don't know what you all need to know. As I say in the film, it took 2 years for me to get permission for the Cubans to go to Sierra Leone. It took another year to edit 175 hours of film into 1 hour and 20 minutes. Yeah, it's nightmarish. If you have any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them.
How did you decide, or how did the people decide in Cuba which people were going to travel? Like they ended up paring it down to 4, Cuco and I don't remember the other one's names, but how did they decide? How was that?
I let them decide. It couldn't be less than 4 because you need 3 people to drum and 1 to sing. I said that the only criteria I had was that it couldn't be 4 men. They had to have a woman, because I think that's a different dynamic. I'm not into that. And I'm really glad that I made that stipulation, because what's happened in their society, as I unpicked later, I didn't realize this at the time, was that it was always passed down woman to woman to woman. It always was. Until Florinda Diago died in 1984. Florinda had 3 daughters, but 2 of them predeceased her. The 3rd one was alive even when I was there, but had a horrific alcohol problem. As I tried to interview her several times, and she would just talk about how much she'd been drinking since the age of 14. She clearly did not pass her Meander secrets to her daughter, who was struggling with this, obviously, all her life. So Florinda died without anointing a successor for the first time. What they did was they called in the local santero, which is fascinating in itself, because it shows some kind of interconnection of Afro-Cuban religions. So they call in the santero, who chooses Cuco as the successor, who's Florinda's eldest grandchild, who's a boy, of course, a guy. Because Santeria is a very male-dominated religion, so he chooses a guy. Cuco told me he's been waiting since 1984 for Florinda to appear to him in a dream and tell him what the secrets are. Only after we go to Africa does he realize he's going to be waiting a really long time, because they're women's secrets. And what happens? So it was kind of a shock for Cuco. Poor old Cuco. What happens when we get to Africa is that they never question that Elvira is the boss, because she's the woman. How can she not be the leader? And even the fact that the Meander, I've never ever heard, or anyone I've ever spoken to has ever heard of another society like this in West Africa, where it's incredibly unusual that they initiate both boys and girls, but that they're mostly girls and that it's always a female leader, but yet you can initiate boys. It's unheard of. I've never come across anything like that. What it tells us about the Bantu, I'm not really sure. But so they never question that Elvira is the leader. And even in Perico, the town they live in Cuba, Cuco thought he was the leader, but everyone else thought Piuya, Florinda's goddaughter, the old lady, was the leader. Whenever you went there and asked, they would always say Piuya's the leader. She thought she was the leader. She says in the film, I'm the chief. Like, okay. But in Cuco's, and she was too old to travel, obviously. She was in her 80s then. But Cuco, in his own head, is the leader. It's not in anyone else's, but we have to just let him be the leader. So yeah, there's this kind of interesting thing happened, but I didn't choose those people, they chose themselves. Cuco chose himself and his grandson. I had already met Alfredo, and the reason I really pushed to have Alfredo, although they said it was okay, was that he is probably the person I'd ever met in Perico who had been pushing this I'm so proud to be African identity when no one else would. He had books and books on Africa. He was famous in the first time I ever met his mother. He was out of Perico, and she let me and the colleague I was with, the Cuban guy who took me there for the first time. She led us into his studio, and his mother just starts going on about, and I find this immensely sad, and I want to say it as a token of sadness, that she was just going on about how ugly his African stuff was. And I think it's immensely sad that this is the kind of way that it's sometimes played out in Cuba, because there has not been this pride in being from Africa, because of the idea that you were all Cuban, and after the revolution that was your only identity, which was why in the film they say there was all these years we couldn't celebrate this stuff. They did it, but they shouldn't have been doing it, because Castro promoted this idea that anything was divisive within Cuban society shouldn't be promoted. And so in some ways they've done an amazing job on racism, in other ways it's been most unfortunate. And so Alfredo was someone who had always pushed for that. And I will never ever forget screening the film back in Perico after it was all finished and done. And you know, everyone came from the town and whatever. And even though the government representatives were there, and you know, it's scary for them, it still is. Even though because of that, Alfredo stood up and he gave this off-the-cuff speech about how we've got it all wrong, folks. We have to be really, really proud of where we come from, just like the people are proud who come from Spain. And it was, people stood and listened and cheered him, and it was a moment I will never forget. So I kind of pressed for him because he had plowed that on his own. I mean, he really had been, he'd brought up his children to believe they should be proud. Other people thought he was nuts. So I really wanted him. And then Elvira was an obvious person because she's Florinda's successor. So yeah, that's kind of how it came about, but I'm really glad. I pushed for a woman, not least because I thought that would have a different relationship with the African women, and I really wanted to have that in the film. I didn't just want it to be loads of guys showing off, you know. Though that happens too. But I'm so glad I did, because then we had the reason that she's never appeared to him in a dream, which is, you know, kind of funny, but also heartbreaking for him. But I shouldn't laugh, but it is quite funny. Yeah, yes.
In the, going back to the Bantu people in Sierra Leone, I was watching closely at both costumes, the man's costume, what everybody's following after, and the woman's costume. In my impression of that was that the woman, they make the woman look like a witch, you know, like, and nobody was touching. In fact, nobody tried to touch the woman, but they follow the man's. It made me feel, because I was teaching, not long ago, I was teaching the culture, like how people celebrate New Year's Eve in different countries. Like for example, in Peru, they have the lions, the Chinese lion, they try to follow him. And it made that impression in my head that they try to touch the lion for good luck.
All right.
So they're touching this other person there.
Yeah.
They're touching the man. Nobody touches a woman.
Interesting.
And by the way that the woman looks like, she looks like a witch, like dark, you know, like expressing darkness, where everybody follows a man. You see, I just wonder if it is the society, it's divided like that in there, like they.
It's what, sorry?
I took it totally different. I took like she was an idol. She was, that's the way I took it. She was.
I confess I've never thought about that. It's a very interesting angle. I've never had a sense from them that they are in any way disrespectful or afraid of that mask. I think they treat it as, yeah. What's kind of fascinating is that that's the only woman-specific mask that's known about in Africa. And it's the only one, I don't know if you've got a sense of this in the film, that covers the whole head. I actually have one in my office. But and the reason for that, of course, is that women's hairstyles are very distinctive. If you cover a man's face, I mean, everyone knows who it is. But the idea is that you can't tell who it is. So if you cover a man's face, he's invisible. Women's hairstyles are very, very distinctive, the way they, you know, have the patterns done. And so you have to cover the whole head for it to be an anonymous person. And so this is the only one that's known about in only these Bantu masks are the only female-specific masks that I think are known about in all of Africa.
Bonji, you say it?
Bantu,
Bondu, Bondu.
which can either be O's or U's, but you pronounce it Bantu, whichever way you write it. Does anyone else have any?
Would you find those Bondu masks? I mean, this was a Bamandi initiation, whatever that village was doing. Was that tied to Bamandi, or was that just tied to the greater wide culture?
They go across the whole area, from even into Liberia, into Guinea, and even into Cote d'Ivoire, to Ivory Coast at the top. And this is something that was replicated absolutely on American plantations across the Americas, because they transcend language, they transcend different gods, they transcend. So there becomes a regional identity in the Americas that is, I don't know particularly about North America, apart from the Sea Islands, that there would be enough people to do that kind of thing. Definitely in Brazil and in the Caribbean there is. Because even today, these are marks of unity, because everybody can understand in some way the Paro and the Bundu, even if they can't understand each other's languages. And so certainly we know, historians know that in Brazil, people were marrying captive slaves, were marrying second generation within not necessarily their ethnic group, but within their regional group. And certainly within people that had come out of this part of Africa, the Paro and the Bundu are absolutely the basis of what they understand life to be. And this happens again in times of tragedy. In the Civil War, you could go and stay with other people that were in the same Paro and Bundu to you. The Paro, the men's society, became a way to, a primary way to raise forces to go and fight, either to protect your people or to save your children from the rebels. The primary way that you do that is through the Paro and Bundu society. So it's almost unimaginable for us how important these things are. You take a new name when you're initiated because you are seen as a new person. You get the cicatrices, that the scarification that people have are cut at this time, and they often demark a skill that you learned or a special trait you're considered to have. And it's really an immense sadness to us that we can no longer pinpoint what those said, what those read. People are doing some work towards it, but it's very difficult to know. But they were a passport that people had, and it's clear why parents did those things and cut the scars onto them and whatever, because it was something that no one could take away. And wherever they went, they would not be something that their captor could read, but they were something that everyone else could read in the same slave pen as you or on the same ship as you. It's a way to say, this is who I am, and this is who I really am beneath this hell that I find myself in now. And so these things all go back to the Paro and Bundu Bush initiations, and they would have existed. Certainly they existed on the Sea Islands. Most likely they existed in other places within the US as well that we just don't know enough about, because obviously they were not anything the planter wrote about. This was not something they were advertising they were doing. But I don't know whether it was, I've never considered that she looked like a witch.
I just made that assumption, but not with respect to them, but it's just that cultures are so different.
Sure.
The way they interpret their music and their dances, and some culture keep the women private, where the man is the one that leads, you know, and then people lead. I follow the lead of the guy that was always, and his costume is much lighter in color, you know, where the woman is all in black. So I kept looking at it and relating to.
Yeah, I'm going to ask them about that next time I see them. I've never thought about that. It's an intriguing question.
The food that they ate in there, I was asking if there were dates, the one that came from the tree, the guy climbs the tree.
No, it's palm oil. It's palm kernels. Yeah, I did not make him do that. I have to always tell him, I did not make Alfredo go up that tree. When I see his face, I'm like, you're not doing that. No, I so did not make him do that. I did not set up that. That's just the Duke for you. Everyone calls him the Duke. That's his nickname. It's like you're not doing that. And he's halfway up the tree. I was like, yeah, I don't know if I had safety approval to do that, but it was kind of funny though. We had these great conversations with them. Where Baggy, the guy whose trees he's going up, has this conversation with us where he says, how do you make oil in Cuba? And we were all looking at each other going, well, we kind of go to the supermarket. I don't know, I don't know what to tell you. But no, it was just amazing. Before I got there with them, was called to this village meeting and I sat down with them and they said, they're just the most amazing people. And I have these conversations that even now I can hardly say to you without just being immensely moved, where they said things like, well, what should we give them to eat? And I said, no, I'll bring food. I mean, I'm not trying to impose on you. I know these are subsistence farmers, right? I was like, I'll bring food. And they, oh no, if you're going to bring half the food, we have to contribute the other half of the food. And you sit there like, really? You're trying to give things to me? I mean, I'm just mind blown. And they were even saying to me, first of all, when they said they wanted us to stay in the village, I said, well, you know, it's difficult because I need to recharge the camera batteries and so on, and they have no electricity, obviously. And they said, well, can we get a generator, and then we'll save up for the gas for the generator? And it was like, I mean, the lengths they went to have us there are just so mind-blowing. But one of the things they wanted to ask me was, what do they eat? What can we get for them to eat? And I said, no, we have to eat, you know, whatever. And Solomon, the young guy, the school teacher, his mom was cooked for us the whole time we were there. Not one of us got sick from a stomach complaint, which, I mean, they have no running, now they have a pumps, an NGO has put a pump in for them. At this point, she's washing the plates with river water, and she's cooking for all these people that have zero experience with microbes from West Africa. Not one of us got sick. I think that is the most amazing, credit to that woman. Whatever we gave her for doing that for us was nowhere near enough. And they have these wonderful things where I remember one question they said to me was, should we collect spoons for them, or do they know how to eat with their hands? Do people eat with their hands in Cuba? Can we collect spoons? And I was like, I can bring spoons, that's okay. And when I got there, I know, it's just like every day, it's just like, when I got there, they dug us this pit toilet, and then they discussed with someone else who'd been to, well, like Solomon, the young guy, the school teacher, he's been to Freetown and stuff, the capital. And he'd been talking to some other people that knew foreigners, and they discussed that going to the toilet is a kind of private affair for us. So they'd made these rush matting doors, like a whole screen around the toilet. They dug a pit and made a thing around it, and then they'd collected all these white stones and put them as a pathway up there. So if we had to go in the night, we could, because there's no lights, obviously, we could find our way up there. I mean, the lengths that they went to are just beyond. And as a colleague of mine that grew up in Africa said, greater love have no village than to dig you a toilet. And I think that's really true. I mean,
do they not dig their own toilets though? Or what are they doing for, nope, just woods?
In the Ebola epidemic, we got that message to them. Right now, go dig toilets. This is what, but no, normally they don't know.
How long did you stay in the village?
We were there for 5 days. I think, yeah, we were in Sierra Leone. No, we were there for a week. We were there for a couple of weeks in Sierra Leone, but we were in the village for like a week, which, you know, it was the most amazing week of my life, easily.
It didn't look hot. You know, it's weird because you're in the tropics, between the, I guess you're West Africa tropics, but I keep waiting to see people sweating profusely because I think I would be.
That was me,
That
but
was
no
you.
one else.
No one else was sweating. Was it not that? Was it hot? I mean,
It's very humid. It's not sunny, but it's very humid.
It just didn't
But
look very hot.
you know, it's very humid. But, you know, they're from Cuba. That's also very hot and humid.
Yeah.
I, however, was sweating, but that's behind the camera, so that was okay. Yeah, no, it's kind of very hot and humid.
Okay, I would have assumed so, but it didn't.
It's just not
It
sunny.
came across like,
Yeah.
it's like 75 degrees there.
No, it was.
No.
It's actually quite nice and cool at night, though, so you can get some sleep, thankfully. Yeah, but yeah, it was. I was
Well,
probably
the heat did
sweating.
not.
The cameramen were probably dripping in sweat
right,
behind the
you
camera.
can catch
but-
that on camera.
Yeah, no, but
so
they
that's
look
good.
very cool at all times. I don't know how they perfect that look. I wish I knew.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions? Wonderful. Let's have a big round of applause for
Thank you so much.